Close your eyes and imagine this. You're standing in the middle of the world's largest desert. Sand stretches endlessly in every direction, golden dunes rolling like frozen waves toward the horizon. The sun blazes overhead, and the heat shimmers in dancing mirages. You haven't seen water in days. Your throat is parched, your lips cracked from the endless dry wind. But wait, do you see that? Far in the distance, something impossible appears, a thin line of green cutting through all that golden emptiness. As you stumble toward it across the burning sand, something magical begins to happen. The air grows cooler. You catch the faint sound of birds singing. And then you see it. A river so magnificent, so life-giving, that it will create the greatest civilization the world has ever known. This is the Nile River. And tonight, along its ancient banks, I'm going to tell you the complete story of ancient Egypt. A story that spans 3,000 years. 3,000 years of god-kings called pharaohs, of pyramids that pierce the sky, of queens who commanded armies and priests who spoke with gods, of triumph and conquest, of glory and eventual fall. You'll meet Khufu, the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid, Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled as pharaoh for 22 years, Akhenaten, the revolutionary king who tried to change everything, Tutankhamun, the boy who became pharaoh at 9 years old, and Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, whose death ended 3 millennia of divine rule. Before we begin, here's a quick favor. Before you get settled, please like this video and subscribe. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is. Just drop a comment and let me know. It's always wonderful to see people from all around the world joining us. Here's what makes this perfect for sleep. This story flows like the Nile itself. It has natural rhythms, gentle currents, and peaceful stretches where your mind can drift. Don't worry about staying awake for all of it. Let the ancient world wash over you like the warm waters of the great river. Are you ready? Then close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's step back 5,000 years to the very beginning of this incredible story. Part 1. The Beginning. Chapter 1. The Gift of the Nile. Picture yourself floating high above the African continent 7,000 years ago. Spread out below you like a vast golden carpet is the Sahara Desert, 6 million square miles of sand and stone, one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. The temperature during the day can reach 120 degrees. At night it can drop below freezing. Rain might not fall for years at a time, but cutting through all that harsh emptiness, like a blue-green lifeline drawn by the gods themselves, flows the Nile River. At 4,132 miles long, it's not just the longest river in the world, it's a miracle of geography that changed the course of human history. Now, here's where the real magic begins. This river doesn't behave like other rivers. Every single year, as predictable as the rising sun, something extraordinary happens to the Nile. Far to the south, in the highlands of Ethiopia, the summer monsoons begin. Heavy rains fall on the mountains, feeding streams that flow into the Blue Nile. Meanwhile, from the heart of Africa, the White Nile carries water from the Great Lakes of the continent's interior. These two mighty branches merge at Khartoum, creating a river so powerful it can carve its way through 1,000 miles of desert. As this floodwater moves north toward the Mediterranean Sea, it performs a miracle that has happened every summer for millions of years. The Nile rises, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until it overflows its banks and spreads across the land on both sides. But this isn't the destructive flooding you might imagine. This is the gentlest, most life-giving flood in nature. For 3 months, the river spreads its bounty across the valley, turning the narrow strip of green into a vast inland lake. Fish swim where yesterday there were wheat fields. Waterfowl by the millions come to nest and feed. Then, as the flood season ends, something even more miraculous happens. The waters slowly recede, leaving behind their greatest gift. Not just moisture for the soil, but soil itself. Rich, black, fertile silt carried from the volcanic highlands of Ethiopia. dirt so perfect for growing crops that the ancient Egyptians believed it was created by the gods specifically for them. They called their homeland Kemet, the Black Land. This wasn't just a name, it was a statement of identity. To an ancient Egyptian, the black soil along the river was the entire universe. Everything beyond it, the endless desert they called the Red Land, was the realm of death and chaos. Imagine being one of the first nomadic people to discover this river paradise. You've been wandering the Sahara for weeks, following seasonal waterholes that have long since dried up. Your small band of hunter-gatherers is desperate. Children are crying from thirst. The elderly are struggling to keep up. Water skins that were full days ago now hang empty and limp. Then you crest a sand dune and see it. A line of green stretching as far as the eye can see. Palm trees swaying in a gentle breeze. The flash of sunlight on flowing water. You race down the dune, your feet sinking into soft, damp earth instead of burning sand. You kneel by the water's edge and drink the sweetest, clearest water you've ever tasted. Around you, life explodes in abundance. Date palms heavy with fruit. Papyrus reeds growing 12 feet tall along the water's edge. Fish jumping in the clear current. Ducks, geese, herons, and ibises filling the sky with their calls. Wild onions and garlic growing in patches along the bank. Lotus flowers blooming in quiet backwaters. This is where you'll stay. This is where your children will be born. This is where your people will plant the seeds of civilization. Those first settlers were remarkably intelligent. They didn't just stumble into farming, they studied the river like scientists. They noticed that the flood came at the same time every year, usually beginning in July. They observed how high the water rose, how long it stayed, and how it gradually receded. Most importantly, they learned to read the signs that predicted a good flood or a bad one. They watched for the heliacal rising of Sirius, the moment when this bright star first becomes visible before dawn. The ancient Egyptians called this star Sopdet, and they believed she was a goddess who announced the coming of the flood. These early people built their settlements with careful thought. Houses went on the highest ground, safe from even the biggest floods. Granaries were built on raised platforms to keep stored grain dry. They learned to weave baskets from palm fronds to store their surplus crops. They domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats, keeping them on high ground during flood season. During the 3 months when the river spread across their fields, life followed a different rhythm. Men would fish in the floodwaters, using nets woven from flax fibers. Children would hunt for bird eggs among the reeds. Women would weave cloth from plant fibers and tend to household tasks. Elderly people would tell stories and pass down the accumulated knowledge of generations. When the floodwaters finally receded, usually in October, the real work began. But what wonderful work it was! The earth was so rich and soft that they could plant seeds simply by scattering them on the ground and having cattle trample them in. Emmer wheat, which would become the bread of Egypt, barley for making beer, the national drink that even children consumed daily, flax for making linen cloth that would eventually dress pharaohs and mummy wrappings. The harvest was so abundant that these early farmers always had surplus grain. This extra food was revolutionary. It meant that not everyone had to spend their entire lives farming. For the first time in human history, people could specialize in other occupations. Some became potters, learning to shape clay from the riverbank into beautiful and functional vessels. Others became weavers, creating increasingly sophisticated textiles. Still others became toolmakers, crafting implements from copper and later bronze. Some became priests, tending small shrines dedicated to the river gods who brought the annual miracle of the flood. Perhaps most importantly, some became traders. They built boats from papyrus reeds and began carrying goods up and down the river. Pottery from one village in exchange for tools from another. Dried fish from the delta in trade for gold from the southern deserts. This trade created connections between communities separated by hundreds of miles. Over many generations, these connections grew stronger. Small villages became towns. Towns began to organize into larger communities with shared governments, shared temples, and shared identities. The stage was being set for something unprecedented in human history, the world's first unified nation. Chapter 2: The First Pharaohs. Fast forward now through 2,000 years of gradual development. It's around 3500 BC, and the small farming villages along the Nile have evolved into something far more complex and sophisticated. The people have learned to work copper and gold. They've developed a system of hieroglyphic writing. They've built impressive temples and elaborate tombs for their leaders. Most significantly, they've organized themselves into two great kingdoms, each with its own distinct culture, gods, and royal traditions. In the north, where the Nile spreads into a vast delta of marshes and waterways before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea, lies Lower Egypt. The name might seem backwards. After all, this region is at the top of most maps of Egypt. But the ancient Egyptians named their regions according to the flow of the river. Lower meant downstream, toward the sea. Lower Egypt is a land unlike anywhere else on Earth. Picture an area larger than modern-day New Jersey, crisscrossed with countless streams, canals, and marshes. During flood season, it becomes a vast inland sea dotted with islands where people wait out the high water. When the floods recede, it transforms into the most fertile farmland imaginable. The people of Lower Egypt become masters of this watery environment. They learn to navigate the maze of channels in boats made from papyrus reeds bundled together and sealed with pitch. They become expert fishermen, developing nets, hooks, and traps to catch the abundant fish. They hunt waterfowl with throwing sticks and learn to raise ducks and geese in captivity. Their society reflects their environment. Lower Egyptian towns are built on islands or raised mounds connected by waterways rather than roads. Their gods are associated with water and fertility: Sobek, the crocodile god, Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth, and Wadjet, the cobra goddess who protects the marshlands. The symbol of Lower Egypt becomes the papyrus plant, that remarkable reed that grows 12 feet tall and provides them with material for boats, baskets, sandals, and eventually the world's first paper. Their kings wear red crowns shaped like the tall papyrus stems, and red becomes the sacred color of northern Egypt. In the south, where the Nile flows between sandstone cliffs and the desert presses closer to the river, lies Upper Egypt. This is a narrower land, but still blessed with that miraculous fertile strip along the riverbank. Here, the river is more predictable, flowing in a single channel between well-defined banks. The people of Upper Egypt become master farmers and craftsmen. They grow the finest wheat and barley in the known world, storing surplus grain in vast granaries that can feed the population for years. They quarry beautiful sandstone and granite from the cliffs that line the river. They mine gold from the eastern desert, making them wealthy through trade with other regions. Upper Egyptian society is more hierarchical and centralized than in the north. Their towns are built in straight lines along the river, connected by roads that run parallel to the water. Their gods reflect their more ordered environment: Ra, the sun god who travels across the sky in his solar boat, Khnum, the ram-headed god who controls the Nile's flood, and Nekhbet, the vulture goddess who protects the southern kingdom. The symbol of Upper Egypt becomes the lotus flower, that beautiful white blossom that emerges from the muddy water to bloom in perfect purity. Their kings wear white crowns shaped like lotus buds, and white becomes the sacred color of southern Egypt. For centuries, these two kingdoms coexist along the Nile. Sometimes they trade peacefully, Lower Egypt's abundant fish and papyrus in exchange for Upper Egypt's grain and gold. Sometimes they compete for territory, especially around the border region where the river begins to spread into the delta. Occasionally they fight outright wars over water rights or trade disputes. But despite their differences, both kingdoms share the fundamental gifts of the Nile. Both worship river gods. Both base their calendar on the annual flood. Both mummify their dead and believe in an afterlife across the western desert where the sun sets each evening. Then, around 3100 BC, everything changes. A king arises in Upper Egypt whose ambitions extend far beyond his traditional southern territory. His name is Narmer, and he's about to become the most important person in ancient Egyptian history. Narmer is not content to rule just the narrow river valley of the south. He looks north toward the wealthy delta region with its abundant fish, its productive farms, and its thriving trade networks. He sees the possibility of something that has never existed before, a unified Egypt that stretches from the Mediterranean Sea to the first cataract of the Nile, more than 600 miles to the south. But Narmer is more than just an ambitious conqueror. He's a visionary who understands that true power comes not just from military victory, but from creating lasting institutions. He's also a brilliant military strategist who knows that conquering the marshlands of Lower Egypt will require careful planning and superior organization. The war that follows is unlike anything seen before in human history. This isn't a raid or a quick battle. It's a systematic campaign of conquest that probably lasts for several years. Narmer has to fight not just armies, but geography itself. The marshy terrain of the delta favors defenders who know the hidden channels and secret paths. We don't have detailed records of the individual battles, but we do have artistic depictions of Narmer's victory. The famous Narmer Palette, a ceremonial piece carved in stone around 3100 BC, shows us scenes from this momentous conquest. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt while striking down a northern enemy with a war mace. On the other side, he wears the red crown of conquered Lower Egypt while inspecting rows of decapitated enemies. But here's what makes Narmer truly remarkable. He proves to be as brilliant a politician as he is a military commander. When victory is finally his, he doesn't simply impose southern rule on the conquered north. Instead, he does something unprecedented in the ancient world. He creates a synthesis of both cultures. Narmer takes the red crown of Lower Egypt and physically combines it with the white crown of Upper Egypt, creating the double crown that will symbolize unified Egypt for the next 3,000 years. He adopts the protective cobra goddess of the north and places her alongside the vulture goddess of the south on his royal regalia. The lotus of Upper Egypt grows beside the papyrus of Lower Egypt in royal art and architecture. Most brilliantly, Narmer establishes his new capital at Memphis, right at the point where Upper Egypt meets the delta region of Lower Egypt. This is more than just a practical choice. It's a powerful symbol that the new unified kingdom belongs equally to both regions. When Narmer places that double crown on his head for the first time, he becomes something entirely new in human history. He becomes Pharaoh, a word that will come to mean far more than just king. Chapter 3. Old Kingdom, Pyramid Builders. The word Pharaoh literally means great house, but to the ancient Egyptians it represented something almost beyond human understanding. The Pharaoh wasn't just a political ruler. He was a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed deity who ruled the heavens. Think about what this means for a moment. When the Pharaoh spoke, people believed they were hearing the voice of God himself. When he gave commands, it was divine will made manifest on earth. When he walked among his people, they were literally in the presence of deity. This divine kingship gave the Pharaoh incredible power. His word was absolute law. No one could question his decisions or disobey his commands. The entire kingdom existed to serve his divine will. But this godlike power came with crushing responsibility. If the Nile flooded too much or too little, it was because the Pharaoh had somehow failed to maintain the cosmic order. If crops failed, if enemies attacked, if disease struck the land, all of it reflected on the Pharaoh's relationship with the gods. The Pharaoh had to perform daily rituals to keep the universe in balance. Every morning he would enter the inner sanctuary of the temple and awaken the god statue, offering it food, clothing, and incense. He had to ensure that temples were built and maintained throughout the kingdom. He had to guarantee that when he died, he would be properly mummified and buried, so that he could continue protecting Egypt from the afterlife. Narmer established a system that would endure for 3 millennia. He founded the first dynasty, the first royal family line that would pass divine kingship from father to son, generation after generation. When he died, his son would undergo the sacred rituals that would transform him from a mortal prince into a living god. These early pharaohs built the first stone temples along the Nile, replacing the simple mud brick shrines of earlier times with monuments designed to last forever. They established a complex government bureaucracy with governors to oversee the provinces, scribes to record the kingdom's business, and tax collectors to gather the surplus grain that funded royal building projects. Most importantly, they established the fundamental principle that would define Egyptian civilization. The pharaoh was Egypt, and Egypt was eternal. Now let's jump forward to around 2700 BC, about 400 years after Narmer's conquest. Egypt has been unified for 4 centuries, and the kingdom has grown incredibly strong and prosperous. This period, which historians call the Old Kingdom, represents Egypt's first golden age. If you were an ordinary Egyptian living during this time, your life would follow the ancient rhythm of the river that had sustained your people for thousands of years. During the 3 months of flood season, when the Nile spread across your fields, you might leave your farming work and join one of the pharaoh's great building projects. The royal government would provide you with food, clothing, and shelter in exchange for your labor. During planting season, you'd return to your fields to sow wheat and barley in the rich, black soil left behind by the flood. You'd plant flax for making linen cloth and vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, and lettuce. If you lived near the river, you'd supplement your diet with fish caught in nets or trapped in pools left behind by the receding flood. Your house would be built of mud bricks dried hard in the Egyptian sun. The walls would be thick to keep the interior cool even during the hottest days. The flat roof would serve as additional living space where you could sleep during summer nights when the indoor temperature became unbearable. Your daily diet would center around bread and beer, the twin staples of Egyptian nutrition. Egyptian bread was hearty and filling, made from emmer wheat ground on stone querns. Egyptian beer was thick and nutritious, more like liquid bread than modern beer. Even children drank beer daily, since it was safer than water and provided essential calories and vitamins. But during this golden age of the Old Kingdom, something extraordinary began happening in Egypt. The pharaohs started building monuments unlike anything the world had ever seen or imagined. It began with Pharaoh Djoser around 2670 BC. Djoser had a remarkable architect named Imhotep, a man so brilliant that later generations would worship him as a god. Imhotep designed something revolutionary for his pharaoh, a tomb built entirely of stone, shaped like a giant staircase reaching toward heaven. The step pyramid at Saqqara became the world's first monumental stone building. But why build such a massive tomb? The answer lies in the ancient Egyptian understanding of death and the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that when a person died, their soul faced a dangerous journey through the underworld. This realm was filled with monsters, obstacles, and tests that could destroy the unwary. Most people needed magic spells, protective amulets, and careful preparation to survive this journey and reach the blessed afterlife. But the pharaoh was different. He was already a god in human form. When he died, he didn't simply go to an afterlife, he rejoined the other gods in the sky. He became a star in the northern heavens, continuing to watch over and protect Egypt for all eternity. The pyramid was designed to facilitate this divine transformation. It was built according to precise astronomical alignments, with passages pointing toward important stars. The pharaoh would be buried deep inside with everything he needed for his eternal life: golden furniture, jeweled ornaments, weapons for fighting the demons of the underworld, and supplies of food and drink. Each pharaoh who came after Djoser tried to build a pyramid that would surpass his predecessors. They experimented with different shapes and angles, learning from their mistakes and constantly improving their techniques. Pharaoh Sneferu, who ruled around 2600 BC, built not one pyramid but three, each one teaching him lessons that he applied to the next. His final pyramid, the Red Pyramid at Dashur, was the world's first true smooth-sided pyramid, a perfect geometric shape that seemed to connect earth and sky. But it was Sneferu's son who would create the most famous monument in human history. His name was Khufu, and around 2580 BC, he began construction of what we now call the Great Pyramid of Giza. Imagine the scale of this incredible project. The finished pyramid would stand 481 feet tall, higher than a 40-story modern skyscraper. Its base would cover more than 13 acres, enough space for 10 football fields. It would contain approximately 2.3 million individual stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. Some of the granite blocks in the internal chambers would weigh as much as 80 tons, equivalent to about 50 modern automobiles. But here's something that might surprise you about this amazing achievement. The Great Pyramid wasn't built by slaves. That's a persistent myth, probably started by Hollywood movies, but it has no basis in historical fact. The pyramid was built by skilled workers who were paid for their labor with food, clothing, housing, and medical care. Most of these workers were farmers who joined the pyramid construction crews during flood season when they couldn't work their own fields. For them, it was seasonal employment that provided steady income during the agricultural off-season. Archaeologists have discovered extensive evidence of these workers' lives. They've found the village where the pyramid builders lived, a planned community with dormitories, workshops, and recreational areas. They've excavated the industrial-scale bakeries that produced thousands of loaves of bread daily to feed the workforce. They've found the medical facilities where injured workers received treatment, including evidence of successful surgery to treat workplace injuries. Most touching of all, they found the cemetery where the pyramid workers were buried. These aren't the graves of oppressed slaves, but the final resting places of people who were honored for their contribution to the Pharaoh's eternal monument. Some workers were even buried in small pyramids of their own, showing how highly their work was valued. The workers themselves left evidence of their pride in the project. Various work gangs gave themselves names, which they carved into the stones as they built. Names like Friends of Khufu, Drunkards of Menkaure, and the Craftsman Gang. These aren't the words of enslaved people, but of workers who took pride in creating something eternal. The logistics of building the Great Pyramid were staggering. Most of the limestone blocks came from quarries right near the pyramid site, but the finest white limestone for the outer casing was quarried at Tura, across the Nile. The red granite blocks for the internal chambers came from Aswan, more than 500 miles to the south. During flood season, when the Nile rose much higher than it does today, boats loaded with stone blocks could sail almost to the base of the pyramid. From there, teams of workers would drag the massive blocks up earthen ramps using ropes, pulleys, and sheer human effort. The ramps probably zigzagged back and forth up the sides of the growing pyramid, allowing workers to move even the heaviest blocks to the top. The precision of their work defies explanation even today. The base of the Great Pyramid is level to within just 2 centimeters, less than an inch across a base that covers 13 acres. The 4 sides are aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions of north, south, east, and west. The internal passages are cut and fitted with mathematical precision that would challenge modern engineers using power tools and laser levels. Inside the pyramid, a complex system of corridors leads to 3 main chambers. The lowest chamber, cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, may have been abandoned during construction when the builders changed their plans. The middle chamber, called the Queen's Chamber, though it probably wasn't intended for a queen, remains mysterious in its purpose. The highest chamber, known as the King's Chamber, was built of polished red granite and designed to house Khufu's mummified body for all eternity. The King's Chamber itself is a masterpiece of ancient engineering. The walls are made of granite blocks so perfectly fitted that you can't slip a knife blade between them. The ceiling consists of 9 granite beams, each weighing about 50 tons, arranged to distribute the enormous weight of the pyramid above. Above this ceiling, 5 additional chambers reduce the pressure on the burial chamber below. When Khufu died, his body would have been mummified according to the most sacred rituals, wrapped in linen bandages, and placed inside a series of nested coffins. The innermost coffin would have been made of solid gold, the next of silver, and the outermost of gilded wood. The burial chamber would have been filled with everything the pharaoh needed for eternal life: furniture, clothing, weapons, food, drink, and countless treasures of gold and precious stones. Khufu's pyramid was soon joined by pyramids for his successors. His son Khafra built a pyramid that appears almost as large as his father's, though it's actually slightly smaller, an optical illusion created by building it on higher ground. Khafra also commissioned the Great Sphinx, that mysterious creature with a lion's body and a human head, carved from a single piece of limestone bedrock. The third pyramid at Giza was built for Menkaura, Khafra's successor. Though smaller than the other two, it was originally cased in red granite from Aswan, making it perhaps the most beautiful of the three pyramids. Together, these three pyramids and their associated temples, causeways, and subsidiary pyramids created the most famous monument complex in the world. For the ancient Egyptians who built them, they represented something far more important than impressive architecture. They were proof that humans, guided by their god-king Pharaoh, could create something truly eternal. As the sun sets over the Giza plateau, painting the pyramids golden in the evening light, you can almost see the ancient workers heading home after another day of building for eternity. The pharaoh's eternal monuments rise against the darkening sky, destined to outlast every civilization that will come after them. This is Egypt at its first great peak, confident in its power, secure in its beliefs, building monuments that connect earth and heaven. The Old Kingdom represents humanity's first attempt to create something permanent, something that would last forever. Part 2. The Golden Age. Chapter 4. Middle Kingdom Recovery. The glory of the Old Kingdom couldn't last forever. By 2200 BC, after nearly 500 years of pyramid building and divine rule, cracks began to show in Egypt's perfect world. The pharaohs had spent enormous resources on their eternal monuments. The kingdom's wealth was tied up in stone pyramids, while the living needs of the people grew more pressing each year. Then disaster struck. For reasons that scientists still debate today, the Nile began to fail. Year after year, the life-giving flood came up short. Sometimes it barely rose at all. Other years it rose too much, destroying crops and homes. The predictable rhythm that had sustained Egypt for over 1,000 years suddenly became chaotic and unreliable. Picture what this meant for ordinary Egyptians. Imagine waking up in July, when the flood should be starting, only to see the Nile flowing at its normal level. The fields that should be underwater remain dry and dusty. Without the flood, there's no rich silt deposited on the farmland. Without the silt, crops won't grow properly. Without good crops, there's no surplus grain to store for lean years. Famine spread across Egypt like a plague. People who had never known hunger began to starve. The pharaoh's granaries, built up over generations of good harvests, slowly emptied. Provincial governors stopped sending taxes to the capital because their own people were desperate for food. The divine pharaoh, who was supposed to control the Nile's flood through his relationship with the gods, seemed powerless. If the pharaoh couldn't make the river behave properly, maybe he wasn't really a god after all. This crisis of faith shattered the religious foundations that had held Egypt together since Narmer's time. Regional governors, called nomarchs, began to act more and more independently. They stopped obeying orders from Memphis. They built up their own armies. They fought each other for control of what little fertile land still produced crops. Egypt, which had been unified for nearly 500 years, began to fall apart. This chaotic period lasted for about 150 years. Historians call it the First Intermediate Period, a time when Egypt had no strong central government, when different regions were ruled by competing pharaohs, when art and literature declined, and when the great building projects stopped completely. But the Egyptian people were resilient. They had survived in the desert for thousands of years before the pharaohs, and they would survive this crisis too. Slowly, gradually, new leaders emerged who promised to restore order and reunite the kingdom. Around 2050 BC, a prince named Mentuhotep from the southern city of Thebes began a campaign to reconquer all of Egypt. Unlike the ancient pharaohs who ruled through divine authority alone, Mentuhotep had to prove himself through military skill and political wisdom. He couldn't simply declare himself pharaoh and expect automatic obedience. He had to earn his kingdom through conquest. The reunification wars were brutal but necessary. Mentuhotep's armies fought their way north, defeating rival claimants and regional strongmen. They captured Memphis, the ancient capital. They pushed into the Delta region and subdued the last holdouts against unified rule. When Mentuhotep finally placed the double crown on his head around 2040 BC, he founded what historians call the Middle Kingdom. But this new Egypt was different from the Old Kingdom in fundamental ways. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom were still considered divine, but their divinity seemed more approachable, more human. Art from this period shows pharaohs with careworn faces, lined with worry and responsibility. These weren't the remote, perfect god-kings of the Pyramid Age. These were rulers who had lived through crisis and understood that kingship meant serving the people as much as being served by them. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs learned from the disasters of the past. Instead of spending all the kingdom's wealth on tombs, they invested in practical projects that would benefit everyone. They built new irrigation canals to carry Nile water to previously unusable land. They drained marshes in the Fayum region, creating thousands of acres of new farmland. They established trade relationships with neighboring kingdoms to ensure alternative sources of food during bad flood years. Literature flourished during the Middle Kingdom as never before. Scribes wrote down stories that had been passed along orally for generations. They created new tales that reflected the changed relationship between pharaoh and people. One famous story, the tale of Sinuhe, tells of an Egyptian official who flees to Syria and lives among foreigners before finally returning home to Egypt. It's a story about identity, loyalty, and what it means to be Egyptian. Another remarkable text from this period is The Admonitions of Ippur, which describes the chaos of the first intermediate period. The author laments that the land turns around as does a potter's wheel, and servants have become masters. It's one of the earliest pieces of social criticism in human history. Art also evolved during the Middle Kingdom. Sculptures became more realistic and emotionally expressive. The famous statue of Pharaoh Sesostris III shows him with a deeply lined face, heavy-lidded eyes, and a mouth turned down with the weight of responsibility. This isn't idealized divine beauty. This is a human ruler bearing the burden of kingship. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs also revolutionized Egypt's foreign policy. Instead of remaining isolated behind their desert barriers, they actively sought trade relationships with other kingdoms. Egyptian merchants traveled to Nubia in the south, trading manufactured goods for gold, ivory, and exotic animals. They established trading posts along the Red Sea coast and sent expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt, somewhere along the coast of modern Somalia or Yemen. These trading expeditions brought new ideas and technologies back to Egypt. Egyptian craftsmen learned new techniques for working metals and creating jewelry. Egyptian artists were exposed to foreign styles that influenced their own work. Most importantly, these trade relationships made Egypt more resilient. If the Nile failed again, Egypt could import grain from other regions. The pharaohs of this era also reformed the government to prevent future collapses. They created a more efficient bureaucracy with clear chains of command and regular reporting requirements. They established royal inspectors who traveled throughout the kingdom to ensure that local officials were doing their jobs properly. They built a professional military with trained officers and standardized equipment. Women gained more prominence during the Middle Kingdom than they had enjoyed during the Old Kingdom. While pharaoh remained a male position, royal women served as regents for young kings and held important religious offices. Some queens were buried in elaborate tombs that rivaled those of pharaohs, showing their elevated status in society. The Middle Kingdom lasted for nearly 400 years, from about 2050 to 1650 BC. During this time, Egypt rebuilt its strength, expanded its borders, and created some of the finest art and literature in its history. The pharaohs established a new capital at Thebes in southern Egypt, though they maintained Memphis as an administrative center. But even this restored golden age couldn't last forever. Around 1650 BC, Egypt faced a new crisis: foreign invasion. A group called the Hyksos, probably from the Levant region of modern Syria and Palestine, began infiltrating the Nile Delta. They brought with them new military technologies that the Egyptians had never seen: horse-drawn chariots, composite bows, and bronze weapons superior to Egypt's copper tools. The Hyksos conquest marked the end of the Middle Kingdom and the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period. Once again, Egypt was divided and ruled by foreigners, but this humiliation would also inspire Egypt's greatest age of all, the New Kingdom, when Egyptian pharaohs would build the largest empire the world had yet seen. Chapter 5. New Kingdom, the Empire. The Hyksos occupation of northern Egypt lasted for over a century, but it taught the Egyptians valuable lessons about military technology and international politics. Egyptian princes in the south, ruling from Thebes, gradually learned to use the same weapons and tactics that had made the Hyksos successful. They acquired horse-drawn chariots, trained professional archers, and developed bronze weapons that could match anything their enemies possessed. Around 1550 BC, Pharaoh Ahmose launched the War of Liberation that would drive the Hyksos out of Egypt and establish the New Kingdom. This wasn't just a restoration of Egyptian independence, it was the beginning of Egypt's transformation into an aggressive, expansionist empire. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom learned that isolation was no longer possible in a world where neighbors possessed advanced military technology. If Egypt wanted to remain secure, it would have to dominate its neighbors before they could threaten Egypt again. This new philosophy led to nearly 500 years of Egyptian imperialism that stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. Chapter 6. Hatshepsut, the Woman Pharaoh. Among all the remarkable rulers of the New Kingdom, none is more fascinating than Hatshepsut, the woman who became pharaoh. Her story begins around 1479 BC, during the reign of her husband, Thutmose II. Hatshepsut was not just a queen, she was Thutmose's principal wife and the daughter of the previous pharaoh, Thutmose I. This gave her impeccable royal bloodlines and considerable political influence. When Thutmose II died after ruling for only about 3 years, he left behind a young son from a minor wife. This boy, who would become Thutmose III, was probably only about 2 years old when he inherited the throne. According to normal Egyptian practice, Hatshepsut should have served as regent, ruling in the child's name until he came of age. But Hatshepsut had bigger plans. Within a few years of her husband's death, she took the extraordinary step of declaring herself pharaoh. This wasn't just a power grab, it was a revolutionary act that challenged thousands of years of Egyptian tradition. Picture the scene when Hatshepsut first appeared before the court, wearing the false beard, the crook and flail, and the double crown of pharaoh. The shock must have been tremendous. No woman had ever claimed the full title and regalia of pharaoh before. Some officials probably thought she had gone mad. Others might have feared that the gods would punish Egypt for this unprecedented violation of cosmic order, but Hatshepsut was far too intelligent to rely on shock value alone. She understood that to succeed as pharaoh, she would need to justify her rule in ways that made sense within Egyptian religious and political tradition. So she created one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns in ancient history. Hatshepsut claimed that the god Amun-Ra himself had chosen her to be pharaoh. She commissioned elaborate reliefs showing the god selecting her while she was still in her mother's womb. She portrayed herself as the god's divine daughter, specifically chosen for kingship regardless of her gender. She also emphasized her royal bloodlines more than any pharaoh before her. Unlike male pharaohs who inherited their position through their fathers, Hatshepsut claimed authority through both her father Thutmose I and her divine selection by the gods. She was careful to show proper respect for Thutmose III, acknowledging him as co-pharaoh while making it clear that she was the senior ruler. Most cleverly, Hatshepsut presented her rule as temporary and necessary. She claimed that the gods had commanded her to serve as pharaoh until Thutmose III was ready to assume full responsibility. This made her seem less like a usurper and more like a devoted stepmother sacrificing for the good of Egypt. Once she had established her legitimacy, Hatshepsut proved to be one of Egypt's most successful rulers. While most New Kingdom pharaohs focused on military conquest, Hatshepsut concentrated on peaceful prosperity. She launched ambitious building projects that employed thousands of workers and showcased Egypt's wealth and power. Her masterpiece was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. This temple was unlike anything ever built in Egypt. Instead of the traditional massive stone blocks and towering walls, Hatshepsut's temple featured elegant terraces that seemed to grow naturally from the cliff face. Colonnaded walkways connected different levels, creating a sense of architectural harmony between human creation and natural landscape. The temple walls told the story of Hatshepsut's greatest achievement, her trading expedition to the land of Punt. Punt was a semi-legendary kingdom located somewhere along the Red Sea coast, probably in modern-day Somalia or Yemen. For centuries, Egyptians had received exotic goods from Punt through intermediaries, but no pharaoh had ever organized a direct expedition to this mysterious land. Hatshepsut's Punt expedition was both a commercial and diplomatic triumph. Her ships returned laden with incense trees, gold, ivory, exotic animals, and aromatic woods. The temple reliefs show Egyptian sailors carrying myrrh trees with their roots carefully preserved in baskets, preparing to transplant them in Egypt. They also show the obese Queen of Punt greeting the Egyptian delegation with gifts and expressions of friendship. But the expedition accomplished more than just trade. It demonstrated Egypt's naval capabilities and established direct diplomatic contact with a distant kingdom. It brought Egypt into contact with new ideas, technologies, and artistic styles. Most importantly, it showed that Egypt could project power and influence far beyond its traditional borders without resorting to military conquest. Hatshepsut ruled for 22 years, from about 1479 to 1458 BC. During this time, Egypt prospered as never before. Trade flourished, art reached new heights of sophistication, and the kingdom enjoyed peace with its neighbors. Hatshepsut's reign demonstrated that effective leadership had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with intelligence, political skill, and genuine concern for the people's welfare. When Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III finally became sole pharaoh at about age 25. Later Egyptian records would try to erase Hatshepsut from history, chiseling her name and image from monuments and omitting her from official king lists. But her achievements were too substantial to be forgotten entirely. Modern archaeology has restored her rightful place as one of Egypt's greatest rulers. Chapter 7. Akhenaten, the Revolutionary. If Hatshepsut challenged Egyptian tradition by being a woman pharaoh, Akhenaten went even further by challenging the very foundations of Egyptian religion and society. His original name was Amenhotep IV, and when he became pharaoh around 1353 BC, he inherited a kingdom at the absolute height of its power and prosperity. Egypt in the mid-14th century BC was the richest, most powerful nation in the known world. Egyptian armies had conquered territories from Nubia to Syria. Tribute and trade goods flowed into Egypt from dozens of subject kingdoms. The temples were filled with gold and precious stones. The pharaoh's court was the most magnificent in the world. But Amenhotep IV looked at this success and decided that everything needed to change. The young pharaoh had apparently experienced some kind of religious revelation that convinced him Egypt's traditional polytheistic religion was wrong. Instead of worshipping hundreds of gods and goddesses, Amenhotep IV believed that there was only one true God, the Aten, represented by the sun disk. This wasn't just a minor theological adjustment. Egyptian religion was woven into every aspect of daily life, government, and culture. The pharaoh himself was considered the son of Ra, the sun god, and the living embodiment of Horus. The priests of various temples controlled enormous wealth and political influence. Local gods protected individual cities and regions. Changing Egypt's religion meant changing everything about Egyptian civilization. Around the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV made his revolutionary intentions clear. He changed his own name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning beneficial to the Aten. He declared that all the traditional gods were false and that only the Aten deserved worship. He ordered the closure of temples throughout Egypt and redirected their wealth to the service of his new god. But Akhenaten went even further. He decided that Egypt itself was contaminated by centuries of false worship. So he abandoned Thebes, Memphis, and all the traditional centers of Egyptian power. Instead, he built an entirely new capital city in the middle of nowhere on the east bank of the Nile in Middle Egypt. He called this city Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten. Today we know it as Amarna. Picture the enormous undertaking involved in building a new capital city from scratch. Thousands of workers had to quarry stone, transport it to the site, and construct palaces, temples, government buildings, and houses for the entire royal court. Officials, priests, craftsmen, and servants had to abandon their established homes and move to an empty desert site simply because the pharaoh had decided that this was where Egypt's capital should be. The city of Akhetaten was unlike any Egyptian city before it. Traditional Egyptian temples were dark, mysterious places where only priests could enter the inner sanctuaries. Akhenaten's Aten temples were open-air structures where sunlight could flood in unobstructed. Traditional Egyptian art depicted gods and pharaohs as idealized, perfect beings. Akhenaten's artists created a new style that was startlingly realistic and often unflattering. The famous bust of Queen Nefertiti, Akhenaten's principal wife, shows this new artistic style at its finest. Her face is beautiful but completely human, with subtle asymmetries and individual characteristics that make her seem like a real person rather than an idealized goddess. Even more striking are the depictions of Akhenaten himself, showing him with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and a protruding belly. Whether these represent his actual physical appearance or are symbolic of some religious concept, they're completely different from the idealized pharaoh portraits of earlier periods. Akhenaten's religious revolution also changed the role of the royal family. In traditional Egyptian religion, the pharaoh was a distant, godlike figure who rarely appeared in public. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were depicted constantly in temple art, often in intimate family scenes with their 6 daughters. They were shown playing with their children, embracing each other, and worshipping the Aten together. The message was clear. This royal family was more accessible and human than their predecessors. But Akhenaten's reforms created enormous problems throughout Egyptian society. The traditional priests, whose temples had been closed and whose livelihoods had been destroyed, became bitter enemies of the new regime. Provincial officials, who had always ruled with the backing of local gods, found their authority undermined. Common people, who had worshipped family gods and local deities for generations, were told that their entire spiritual universe was false. Even worse, Akhenaten's obsession with religious reform distracted him from the practical business of governing an empire. Egyptian territories in Syria and Palestine, which required constant military attention to remain loyal, began to revolt. Vassal kingdoms stopped sending tribute. Egypt's enemies saw weakness and began to probe Egyptian defenses. Letters from this period, found at Amarna, show desperate pleas from Egyptian governors and allied kings begging for military support that never came. While Akhenaten focused on building temples to the Aten, Egypt's hard-won empire began to crumble. The Amarna period lasted for about 17 years, but it was too radical to survive Akhenaten's death. When the pharaoh died around 1336 BC, his religious revolution died with him. The new capital was abandoned. The temples to the Aten were closed. The traditional gods were restored to their places of honor. Within a generation, it was as if Akhenaten had never existed. Chapter 8. Tutankhamun, the Boy King. The story of the pharaoh who restored traditional Egyptian religion begins with tragedy and mystery. When Akhenaten died around 1336 BC, he left behind no clear adult heir to the throne. After a brief, confused period involving shadowy figures whose identities we still don't fully understand, the crown passed to a boy of about 9 years old whose original name was Tutankhaten. This child pharaoh had probably been born in the new capital of Akhetaten during the height of Akhenaten's religious revolution. He may have been Akhenaten's son, though the exact family relationships from this period remain unclear due to incomplete records and the later attempts to erase the Amarna period from Egyptian history. Picture this 9-year-old boy suddenly thrust into the most powerful position in the world. One day he's playing with toys and learning to read hieroglyphs, and the next day he's expected to rule an empire stretching from Nubia to Syria. He wears the heavy double crown that's almost too big for his small head. He sits on the golden throne of Pharaoh in a palace filled with adults who watch his every word and gesture. But of course, a 9-year-old couldn't really rule Egypt. Real power was held by a group of advisors who had survived from the previous reign and were determined to undo Akhenaten's radical reforms. The most important of these advisors were an elderly courtier who may have been related to Queen Nefertiti, and Horemheb, a general who commanded the Egyptian army. These advisors faced an enormous challenge. Akhenaten's religious revolution had created chaos throughout Egypt and the empire. The traditional priesthood had to be restored and their temples rebuilt. The abandoned capital city of Memphis had to be reoccupied and its government functions restored. Most urgently, military campaigns had to be launched to regain control of the rebellious territories in Syria and Palestine. The young pharaoh's advisors decided that the first step was to symbolically break with the Amarna period. They changed the boy's name from Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling the restoration of the traditional god Amun-Ra to his position as Egypt's chief deity. They moved the capital back to Memphis and reopened the temples that Akhenaten had closed. A formal decree was issued in Tutankhamun's name, though it was clearly written by his advisors. This decree announced that the gods had been angry with Egypt because of Akhenaten's reforms, but now they were pleased because traditional worship had been restored. The temples would be rebuilt, the priests would be reinstated, and Egypt would return to the religious practices that had made it great. Under his advisors' guidance, young Tutankhamun launched military campaigns to restore Egyptian control over the empire. Egyptian armies marched into Nubia and reasserted Pharaoh's authority over the gold mines and trade routes of the south. Other expeditions moved north into Palestine and Syria, fighting to regain territories that had been lost during Akhenaten's neglect of foreign policy. The boy pharaoh was even taken on some of these military campaigns, probably more for symbolic purposes than actual leadership. Images from his tomb show him as a warrior pharaoh, riding in a war chariot and shooting arrows at Egypt's enemies. Whether he actually participated in combat or these scenes are artistic fiction, they demonstrate that his advisors wanted him to be seen as a traditional conquering pharaoh. As Tutankhamun grew from child to teenager, he seems to have taken more active control of his kingdom. He married Ankhesenamun, one of Akhenaten's daughters, and probably his own half-sister, following royal custom. Palace records suggest that he began to make more independent decisions and may have started to chafe under the control of his advisors. But Tutankhamun's story came to an abrupt end when he died around 1323 BC at approximately 18 years old. The cause of his death remains one of Egyptology's greatest mysteries. Some scholars have suggested that he died in a chariot accident, pointing to evidence of injuries to his chest and skull. Others have proposed that he died of disease, perhaps malaria, or a genetic disorder common in the inbred royal family. Most intriguingly, some evidence suggests that Tutankhamun might have been murdered. X-rays of his mummy show damage to his skull that could have been caused by a blow to the head. The young pharaoh died at a time when he was beginning to assert his independence from his advisors, and his death cleared the way for first I and then Horemheb to rule Egypt as pharaoh. Whatever the cause of his death, Tutankhamun was buried with unprecedented magnificence. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings was packed with over 5,000 individual objects, including golden thrones, chariots, weapons, jewelry, and clothing. His mummy was placed inside 3 nested coffins, the innermost made of solid gold weighing over 200 pounds. The most famous artifact from his tomb is the golden death mask that covered the mummy's head. This mask, crafted from over 20 pounds of solid gold and inlaid with lapis lazuli and other precious stones, shows the young pharaoh's idealized face surrounded by the symbols of divine kingship. It's one of the most beautiful objects ever created and has become the iconic image of ancient Egypt. Ironically, Tutankhamun became more famous in death than he ever was in life. When British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered his tomb in 1922, it was the most complete pharaoh's burial ever found. The discovery created a worldwide sensation and sparked a new wave of interest in ancient Egypt that continues today. Chapter 9. Ramesses the Great. After the chaos of the Amarna period and the brief reign of the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun, Egypt needed a strong leader who could restore the kingdom's power and prestige. That leader emerged in the person of Ramesses II, who became pharaoh around 1279 BC and ruled for an incredible 66 years. Ramesses came from a military family that had risen to power during the Restoration period following Akhenaten's religious revolution. His grandfather, Ramesses I, had been a general who became pharaoh after the death of Tutankhamun's successor, I. His father, Seti I, was a successful warrior king who began the process of rebuilding Egypt's empire and restoring its international prestige. But it was Ramesses II who would become the greatest pharaoh of the new kingdom and one of the most famous rulers in all of ancient history. Modern Egyptologists call him Ramesses the Great, and for good reason. During his long reign, he expanded Egypt's borders, built more monuments than any other pharaoh, and created a period of peace and prosperity that lasted for generations. From the beginning of his reign, Ramesses demonstrated the ambition and energy that would characterize his entire career. While still in his 20s, he launched military campaigns to reclaim territories that Egypt had lost during the troubled Amarna period. He fought against the Nubians in the south, the Libyans in the west, and most famously, the Hittites in the north. The Hittite Empire, centered in modern-day Turkey, was Egypt's greatest rival during the New Kingdom period. These two superpowers had been fighting for control of Syria and Palestine for generations, with neither able to achieve decisive victory. Ramesses was determined to succeed where his predecessors had failed. The climax of the Egyptian-Hittite conflict came at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC. This massive battle, involving thousands of soldiers, hundreds of chariots, and the most advanced military technology of the ancient world, would become one of the most famous conflicts in ancient history. Ramesses led his army north through Palestine and into Syria, confident that his forces could crush the Hittites once and for all. But the Hittite king Muwatalli II was an equally skilled military commander who had prepared a trap for the young Egyptian pharaoh. When Ramesses arrived at Kadesh with his advance guard, he found what appeared to be a lightly defended city. Eager for easy victory, he ordered an immediate attack. But as the Egyptian forces approached Kadesh, thousands of Hittite chariots suddenly appeared from hidden positions behind the city. Ramesses found himself surrounded and outnumbered, with his main army still miles away. The situation looked hopeless for the Egyptian pharaoh and his men. What happened next became the stuff of legend. According to Ramesses' own account, carved on temple walls throughout Egypt, the pharaoh called upon the god Amun-Ra for assistance. Inspired by divine power, Ramesses single-handedly charged into the Hittite forces, scattering them like chaff before the wind. His bravery rallied the Egyptian troops, who fought with superhuman courage until reinforcements arrived to complete the victory. The reality was probably less dramatic, but equally significant. The Battle of Kadesh ended in what military historians would call a tactical draw. Neither side achieved decisive victory, and both armies withdrew from the field claiming triumph. But the strategic result was that Egypt and the Hittite Empire realized they were too evenly matched to defeat each other through military means alone. This realization led to one of the most important diplomatic achievements of the ancient world. Around 1259 BC, Rameses and the Hittite king Hattusili III negotiated the world's first known peace treaty between major powers. This treaty, versions of which have been found in both Egypt and Turkey, established permanent peace between the two empires, defined their mutual borders, and created a military alliance against common enemies. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty was more than just a cessation of hostilities. It was a sophisticated diplomatic agreement that included provisions for extraditing fugitives, protecting merchants and diplomats, and providing mutual assistance in case of internal rebellions. To seal the agreement, Rameses married a Hittite princess, cementing the alliance between the former enemies. With peace established on his northern borders, Rameses could focus on the internal development of his kingdom. And develop it he did, launching the most ambitious building program in Egyptian history. Rameses built or expanded temples throughout Egypt, but his masterpiece was the great temple complex at Abu Simbel in southern Egypt. Abu Simbel was carved directly into the cliff face overlooking the Nile, and its scale is almost beyond comprehension. The main temple facade features 4 colossal statues of Rameses II, each standing 65 feet tall and weighing over 1,000 tons. These statues show the pharaoh seated on his throne, wearing the double crown of Egypt, with smaller figures of his family members carved around his legs. The temple's interior is equally impressive, with halls supported by massive columns carved to represent Osiris, the god of the afterlife. The walls are covered with relief carvings showing Ramesses' victories in battle, his relationships with the gods, and his divine role as pharaoh. Deep inside the temple, in the most sacred sanctuary, stand statues of Ramesses alongside the gods Ra-Harakti, Amun-Ra, and Ptah. Most remarkably, the temple was oriented so that twice a year, on Ramesses' birthday and coronation day, the rising sun would penetrate the temple's entire length and illuminate the statues in the inner sanctuary. This feat of ancient engineering demonstrates the sophisticated astronomical knowledge of Egyptian architects. Rameses also built a smaller temple at Abu Simbel dedicated to his beloved wife Nefertari and the goddess Hathor. This temple, though smaller than the main temple, is equally impressive in its artistry and shows the high status that Nefertari enjoyed as queen. Throughout his long reign, Rameses proved to be as prolific in his personal life as he was in his building projects. He had over 100 children from multiple wives and concubines, ensuring a substantial royal family to carry on his dynasty. His principal wife, Nefertari, was clearly his favorite and appears alongside him in many temple reliefs. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is one of the most beautiful in all of Egypt, with wall paintings that are masterpieces of ancient art. Rameses lived to be over 90 years old, an incredible age for any person in the ancient world and virtually unheard of for a pharaoh. When he finally died around 1213 BC, he had outlived many of his own children and was succeeded by his 13th son, Merneptah. His mummy, discovered in 1881, shows a tall, powerful man with reddish hair and strong features, still impressive even after more than 3,000 years. Chapter 10. Gods and Afterlife. To understand ancient Egypt, you must understand that the Egyptians lived in a world filled with gods. These weren't distant, abstract deities. They were active participants in daily life who controlled everything from the Nile's flood to the movement of the sun across the sky. The Egyptian pantheon included hundreds of gods and goddesses, each with their own personalities, powers, and areas of influence. At the head of this divine family stood Ra, the sun god, who was considered the king of all gods and the source of all life. Every morning, Ra would begin his journey across the sky in his solar boat, bringing light and warmth to the world. At sunset, he would enter the underworld and spend the night fighting the forces of chaos and darkness. His victory over these evil forces ensured that the sun would rise again the next morning. Ra was often combined with other gods to create even more powerful deities. Amun-Ra, the combination of Ra with Amun, the hidden god of Thebes, became the supreme god of Egypt during the New Kingdom period. The pharaoh himself was considered the son of Ra, which gave him divine authority to rule Egypt. But perhaps no god was more important to ordinary Egyptians than Osiris, the ruler of the afterlife. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris had once been a pharaoh of Egypt, who ruled wisely and taught people how to farm and live in civilized society. However, his jealous brother Set murdered him, cut his body into pieces, and scattered them throughout Egypt. Osiris's devoted wife Isis searched throughout the land, found all the pieces of her husband's body, and used her magical powers to restore him to life. However, Osiris couldn't return to the land of the living. Instead, he became the ruler of the afterlife, judging the souls of the dead and granting eternal life to those who proved worthy. Isis herself became one of Egypt's most beloved goddesses. She was the goddess of magic, motherhood, and protection. Egyptian women prayed to her for help in childbirth, for protection of their children, and for magic to solve their problems. Her worship eventually spread throughout the Mediterranean world and continued long after the fall of Egyptian civilization. The story of Osiris, Isis, and Set explained many things that were important to the Egyptians. It showed how death could be overcome through proper preparation and divine assistance. It demonstrated the power of love and loyalty to triumph over evil. Most importantly, it provided a model for what happened to people after they died. Ancient Egyptians believed that death was not the end of existence, but a transition to a different kind of life. However, this transition was dangerous and required careful preparation. When someone died, their soul had to journey through the underworld, face various tests and challenges, and ultimately appear before Osiris for final judgment. The process began immediately after death with mummification. This wasn't just about preserving the physical body, it was about creating a permanent home for the soul in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that the soul consisted of several parts, including the K, life force, and the Ba, personality, and these spiritual elements needed a physical body to inhabit in the afterlife. The mummification process was incredibly complex and could take up to 70 days to complete. First, the internal organs were removed and preserved separately in special containers called canopic jars. The brain was extracted through the nose using long bronze hooks. Though the Egyptians didn't understand its importance and usually discarded it, the body was then packed with natron, a naturally occurring salt that dried out all the moisture and prevented decay. After 40 days in the natron, the body would be completely desiccated but perfectly preserved. The embalmers would then wrap the body in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, placing protective amulets between the layers. The most important of these amulets was the heart scarab, placed over the heart to ensure it would speak favorably for the deceased during the final judgment. Other amulets protected different parts of the body and provided magical assistance during the dangerous journey through the underworld. For wealthy Egyptians, the mummy would be placed inside a series of nested coffins, each more elaborate than the last. The innermost coffin might be made of solid gold, while the outer coffins were usually made of wood covered with gold leaf and decorated with religious scenes and protective spells. But physical preparation was only part of what was needed for a successful afterlife. The deceased also needed to know the correct spells, passwords, and procedures for navigating the underworld. This magical knowledge was compiled in texts that modern scholars call the Book of the Dead, though the Egyptians knew it as the Book of Coming Forth by Day. The Book of the Dead wasn't a single book, but rather a collection of about 200 different spells and instructions that could be customized for each individual. Wealthy people would have personalized versions written on papyrus and placed in their tombs. Poorer people might have just a few key spells written on their coffins or on small papyrus scrolls. These spells covered every aspect of the afterlife journey. There were spells for transforming into different animals or birds, spells for crossing the lakes of fire in the underworld, spells for recognizing and avoiding the demons and monsters that threaten souls on their journey. Most importantly, there were spells to help the deceased pass the final judgment before Osiris. The final judgment was the culmination of the afterlife journey. The deceased would stand before Osiris in the Hall of Two Truths, surrounded by 42 divine judges, representing different aspects of justice and morality. The person's heart, which the Egyptians believed contained their conscience and moral character, would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was lighter than the feather, meaning the person had lived a good and truthful life, they would be granted eternal life in the field of reeds, a paradise that was like an idealized version of Egypt, where the deceased could enjoy all the pleasures of earthly life forever. But if the heart was heavier than the feather, weighed down by sin and evil deeds, it would be devoured by Ammit, a terrifying creature with the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. This was the second death, the complete destruction of the soul, which the Egyptians feared more than physical death itself. The judgment scene was depicted in countless tombs and papyrus scrolls, showing the deceased kneeling before Osiris, while the jackal-headed god Anubis weighs their heart against Ma'at's feather. The ibis-headed god Thoth records the results, while the deceased recites the negative confession, a list of 42 sins they claim never to have committed. This emphasis on moral judgment in the afterlife was one of ancient Egypt's greatest contributions to human civilization. Long before other cultures developed sophisticated ethical systems, the Egyptians believed that how you lived your life determined your fate after death. This encouraged people to live ethically and treat others with justice and compassion. The Egyptian concept of the afterlife also influenced their approach to this life. Since they believed death was just a transition to another form of existence, they saw earthly life as a preparation period. Building a tomb, acquiring the proper burial goods, and learning the necessary spells were all part of preparing for what they saw as the most important journey of all. For the pharaoh, this preparation was even more elaborate. As a god-king, the pharaoh didn't just hope to pass the judgment of Osiris, he expected to join the gods themselves in the heavens. This is why pharaohs built such massive tombs and filled them with such incredible treasures. They weren't just preparing for a comfortable afterlife. They were preparing to assume their place among the immortal gods who ruled the universe. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in the world, describe the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife in cosmic terms. The pharaoh would climb a stairway to the sky, sail with Ra in his solar boat, and become a star in the northern heavens. From this divine vantage point, the pharaoh would continue to protect Egypt and ensure the annual Nile flood that sustained all life in the kingdom. This complex system of beliefs about death and the afterlife shaped every aspect of Egyptian civilization. It explains why the Egyptians spent so much time, energy, and resources on tombs and burial goods. It explains why they developed such sophisticated techniques for mummification and why they wrote down so many detailed instructions for navigating the underworld. Most importantly, it explains why Egyptian civilization lasted for over 3,000 years. The Egyptians created a culture that was designed to last forever, just like the souls of the people who created it. Their temples, tombs, and monuments were built not just for this life, but for all eternity. Their art and writing were created to preserve the memory of individuals and their deeds for all time. In the Egyptian worldview, death was not an ending, but a beginning. Every person who died properly prepared could achieve immortality. Every pharaoh who was correctly mummified and buried would become a god. Every temple built to the proper specifications would serve as a house for the gods forever. This belief in eternal life gave Egyptian civilization a stability and continuity that no other ancient culture achieved. While other kingdoms rose and fell, Egypt endured. While other peoples changed their customs and beliefs, Egypt maintained the same basic religious and cultural patterns for millennium after millennium. The gods of Egypt, Ra and Osiris, Isis and Anubis, Thoth and Maat, weren't just supernatural beings to be worshipped. They were the fundamental forces that kept the universe running properly. By honoring these gods and following their laws, the Egyptians believed they were participating in the cosmic order that sustained all existence. This participation in cosmic order wasn't limited to religious rituals and temple worship. It extended to every aspect of daily life. Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice, required that people deal honestly with each other, that judges make fair decisions, that rulers care for their subjects' welfare. The concept of Ma'at became the foundation of Egyptian ethics, law, and government. When Egyptians died and faced the judgment of Osiris, they weren't just judged on whether they had performed the correct religious rituals, they were judged on whether they had lived according to Ma'at, whether they had told the truth, treated others fairly, and contributed to the harmony and order of society. This integration of religious belief with ethical behavior was one of ancient Egypt's greatest achievements. Long before the development of the great world religions, the Egyptians created a system that encouraged moral behavior by linking it directly to the soul's fate in the afterlife. This system helped create one of the most stable and long-lasting civilizations in human history, a civilization that would endure from the time of the pyramids to the age of Cleopatra and beyond. Part 3. Slow Decline. Chapter 11. Foreign Rulers Arrive. The golden age of the New Kingdom couldn't last forever. By 1100 BC, after nearly 500 years of imperial glory, cracks began to show in Egypt's mighty empire. The last great pharaohs of the New Kingdom had spent enormous resources fighting wars in distant lands. The royal treasury, once overflowing with tribute from conquered territories, was gradually emptying. The priesthood had grown so wealthy and powerful that they sometimes challenged the pharaoh's authority. Most seriously, Egypt was facing new threats from peoples who had never before posed a danger to the kingdom. From the west came the Libyans, nomadic tribes who had been pushed out of their traditional lands by climate change and population pressure. From the north came the mysterious Sea Peoples, maritime raiders who had already destroyed the Hittite Empire and were threatening civilizations throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The last pharaohs of the New Kingdom fought desperately to hold their empire together. Ramesses III, who ruled around 1186 BC, won several important victories against both the Libyans and the Sea Peoples. But these victories came at enormous cost in both money and manpower. Egypt survived, but it was weakened and exhausted. After Ramesses III's death, the New Kingdom entered a slow but irreversible decline. One pharaoh after another proved unable to maintain control over the vast territories that Egypt had conquered during its imperial age. Syria and Palestine broke away first, followed by Nubia. Even within Egypt itself, rival claimants began fighting for the throne. By 1077 BC, Egypt had effectively split into two separate kingdoms again. In the north, pharaohs based in the delta city of Tanis maintained control over Lower Egypt. In the south, the high priests of Amun at Thebes ruled Upper Egypt as an independent theocratic state. The unified kingdom that had lasted for over 2,000 years was broken. This weakness invited foreign intervention. Around 945 BC, a Libyan dynasty seized power in northern Egypt. These weren't foreign conquerors in the traditional sense. They were descendants of Libyan soldiers who had served in the Egyptian army for generations and had gradually risen to positions of power and influence. The Libyan pharaohs, known to historians as the 22nd dynasty, were fully Egyptianized by the time they took power. They worshipped Egyptian gods, wrote in hieroglyphs, built Egyptian-style temples, and maintained all the traditional ceremonies of pharaonic rule. To most Egyptians, they seemed like legitimate pharaohs, even though their ancestors had come from beyond Egypt's traditional borders. The most famous of these Libyan pharaohs was Shoshenq, who ruled around 945 BC. Shoshenq attempted to restore Egypt's empire by launching military campaigns into Palestine. The Bible records his invasion of Jerusalem during the reign of King Rehoboam, when he carried away treasures from Solomon's temple. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Egypt might regain its former imperial glory. But the Libyan restoration was short-lived. Egypt lacked the resources and population to sustain a new imperial expansion. The kingdom gradually fragmented into multiple competing dynasties, with different pharaohs controlling different regions and constantly fighting each other for supremacy. While Egypt was weakening, new powers were rising in Africa. Far to the south, beyond the traditional borders of Egyptian Nubia, a kingdom called Kush had been growing steadily stronger. The Kushites had learned Egyptian military techniques, adopted Egyptian religious practices, and built their own version of Egyptian civilization along the Nile. Around 750 BC, the Kushite king Piye decided that he was the legitimate heir to the pharaohs and launched an invasion of Egypt from the south. This was a complete reversal of the traditional relationship between Egypt and Nubia. Now the southern kingdom was conquering the north. Piye's invasion was remarkably successful. His armies swept through Upper Egypt, capturing Thebes and Memphis with relatively little resistance. Many Egyptians actually welcomed the Kushite conquest, seeing Piye as a restorer of traditional Egyptian values rather than a foreign invader. The Kushite pharaohs, known as the 25th dynasty or the Black Pharaohs, proved to be some of Egypt's most devoted traditionalists. They were more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves, reviving ancient religious practices that had been neglected for centuries and building pyramids in the old style at their capital city of Nuri in modern Sudan. Under Kushite rule, Egypt experienced a remarkable cultural renaissance. Art and architecture flourished as the new pharaohs commissioned temples, statues, and reliefs that rivaled the masterpieces of the Old and New Kingdoms. The Kushites particularly favored the god Amun-Ra and built magnificent temples to him throughout Egypt and Nubia. The most famous of the Kushite pharaohs was Taharqa, who ruled from 690 to 664 BC. Taharqa was a great builder who left monuments throughout Egypt and Nubia. He also attempted to restore Egypt's international prestige by intervening in the politics of Palestine and Syria, even allying with the Hebrew kingdoms against the rising power of Assyria. But Taharqa's foreign policy adventures brought Egypt into conflict with the most powerful empire of the ancient world. The Assyrians, based in northern Iraq, had built a military machine that was virtually unstoppable. Their iron weapons, siege engines, and professional army had conquered most of the Middle East, and now they turned their attention to Egypt. The Assyrian invasion of Egypt began around 671 BC under King Esarhaddon. The Assyrians had several advantages over the Egyptians: superior iron weapons against Egypt's bronze ones, more advanced siege techniques, and a larger population to draw soldiers from. Most importantly, they had developed new military tactics specifically designed to overcome Egypt's traditional advantages. The war between Assyria and Egypt lasted for decades, with victories and defeats on both sides. Taharqa initially held his own against the Assyrian invaders, using Egypt's traditional advantages, knowledge of local terrain, the barrier of the desert, and the loyalty of the Egyptian people, to resist the foreign conquest. But the Assyrians were persistent and resourceful. They built a network of local allies among Egyptian nobles who were willing to collaborate with the invaders. They adapted their military tactics to Egyptian conditions, learning to fight in the desert and to navigate the maze of Nile channels in the delta. Most devastatingly, the Assyrians targeted Egypt's economic foundation. They disrupted trade routes, destroyed irrigation systems, and carried off the accumulated wealth of temples and palaces. Even when they couldn't hold territory permanently, they could impoverish it so thoroughly that resistance became impossible. The final Assyrian conquest came around 664 BC, when Taharqa's successor Tantamani was defeated and the Kushite dynasty was driven back to Nubia. For the first time in over 2,000 years, Egypt was ruled by a genuinely foreign power that had no connection to Egyptian traditions or culture. But the Assyrian occupation of Egypt was brief and troubled. The Assyrians were skilled at conquest but poor at administration. They relied on local Egyptian nobles to actually govern the country, which meant that real power remained in Egyptian hands even when foreigners held the throne. More importantly, the Assyrian Empire was overextended and facing rebellions throughout its territories. Egypt was too distant and too different from Assyria's core territories to be governed effectively from Nineveh. The Assyrians found themselves constantly fighting revolts and rebellions throughout the Nile Valley. Around 656 BC, an Egyptian noble named Psamtik I, who had initially collaborated with the Assyrians, declared independence and founded what historians call the 26th dynasty, or the Sate period. Psamtik and his successors managed to drive the Assyrians out of Egypt and restore native Egyptian rule. The Sate pharaohs were conscious that they were ruling a kingdom that had lost much of its former glory. They responded by deliberately reviving the art, architecture, and religious practices of Egypt's golden ages. Sate period art carefully copied the styles of the Old Kingdom, while Site temples were built according to New Kingdom plans. This conscious archaism wasn't just nostalgia, it was a political statement. By reviving ancient Egyptian traditions, the Site pharaohs were asserting that Egypt remained Egypt, regardless of temporary foreign occupations. They were creating a sense of cultural continuity that would help Egypt survive even more devastating foreign conquests in the centuries to come. But even as Egypt was recovering from the Assyrian conquest, new threats were emerging from the east. The Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BC, was expanding rapidly in all directions. Within a generation, the Persians had conquered the Babylonians, the Lydians, and most of the Greek city-states in Asia Minor. In 525 BC, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt with a massive army. The last Sate pharaoh, Psamtik III, fought bravely but was overwhelmed by Persian numbers and superior organization. Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire, ruled by Persian governors called satraps. The Persian conquest was different from previous foreign occupations. While the Libyans and Kushites had adopted Egyptian culture and ruled as traditional pharaohs, the Persians maintained their own distinct identity. They ruled Egypt as conquerors, not as Egyptians. However, the Persians were skilled administrators who understood the importance of respecting local traditions. They allowed Egyptian temples to continue functioning, maintained the traditional Egyptian calendar, and even had some Persian kings depicted in pharaonic regalia on temple walls. The Persian period lasted for about 200 years, from 525 to 332 BC, with one brief interruption when native Egyptian rebels managed to restore independence for about 60 years. During this time, Egypt remained culturally Egyptian even under foreign political control. The hieroglyphic writing system continued to be used, traditional religious practices were maintained, and Egyptian art and architecture evolved according to their own internal logic rather than Persian influences. Chapter 12. Alexander and the Greeks. In 336 BC, a 20-year-old prince named Alexander became king of Macedonia, a small kingdom in northern Greece. Within just 13 years, this young man would conquer most of the known world and change the course of human history. His conquest of Egypt in 332 BC would begin the final chapter in the story of pharaonic civilization. Alexander was the son of Philip II of Macedonia, a brilliant military commander who had unified most of Greece under Macedonian leadership. But Alexander had ambitions that stretched far beyond his father's achievements. He dreamed of conquering the Persian Empire and spreading Greek culture throughout the known world. Alexander had been educated by the philosopher Aristotle, who had taught him to appreciate not just military conquest, but also art, science, and culture. Unlike purely destructive conquerors, Alexander saw himself as a civilizer who would bring the benefits of Greek learning and culture to the peoples he conquered. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia in 334 BC, He carried with him not just an army, but also scholars, artists, engineers, and administrators who would help him govern his future empire. His goal wasn't just to defeat the Persians, but to create a new kind of civilization that would combine the best elements of Greek and local cultures. Alexander's march to Egypt was part of his larger campaign against the Persian Empire. After defeating Persian armies in Asia Minor and Syria, he turned south toward Egypt, which had been a Persian province for nearly 200 years. The Egyptians, who had never fully accepted Persian rule, were ready to welcome any conqueror who promised to liberate them from Persian control. When Alexander arrived at the Egyptian border in late 332 BC, he was met not by resistance, but by celebration. Egyptian priests and nobles came out to greet him as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The Persian satrap who governed Egypt for the Persian king surrendered without a fight, recognizing that his position was hopeless. Alexander's entry into Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, was staged as a traditional pharaonic coronation. Egyptian priests performed the ancient rituals that transformed the young Macedonian king into a legitimate pharaoh. They declared that he had been chosen by the gods to rule Egypt and gave him the traditional pharaonic names and titles. But Alexander was more than just another foreign conqueror adopting Egyptian customs for political convenience. He seems to have been genuinely fascinated by Egyptian culture and religion. Shortly after his coronation in Memphis, he made a dangerous journey across the western desert to visit the oracle of Amun-Ra at the Siwa oasis. The journey to Siwa was both physically challenging and politically significant. The oasis was located 300 miles west of the Nile Valley, across some of the most difficult desert terrain in Egypt. Ancient sources tell us that Alexander's party got lost in a sandstorm and was only saved when divine ravens appeared to guide them to safety. At the Siwa oasis, Alexander consulted the oracle of Amun-Ra, who the Greeks identified with their own god Zeus. The exact details of what happened during this consultation remain mysterious, but Alexander emerged from the temple convinced that he was not just a pharaoh, but actually the son of a god. This divine confirmation had profound effects on Alexander's future career. It gave him a religious authority that complemented his military power and helped him rule over the diverse peoples of his growing empire. It also influenced his decision to found a new city on the Egyptian coast that would become one of the most important cities in the ancient world. Alexander chose the site for his new city with characteristic brilliance. Located on a limestone ridge between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, the city had access to both sea and river transport. The natural harbors could accommodate the largest ships, while the lake provided a connection to the Nile and the interior of Egypt. Alexander personally laid out the basic plan of the city, using barley flour to mark the streets since no chalk was available. According to legend, birds immediately flew down to eat the barley, which the city's planners interpreted as a sign that the new city would attract people from all over the world. Construction of Alexandria began immediately after Alexander's visit in 331 BC. The city was designed according to the most advanced principles of Greek urban planning, with wide streets laid out in a rectangular grid, public spaces for markets and assemblies, and separate districts for different ethnic groups. But Alexander himself never saw his city completed. After founding Alexandria, he continued his conquests eastward, marching through Persia, Afghanistan, and India before dying in Babylon in 323 BC at the age of just 32. His vast empire immediately began to break apart as his generals fought for control of different regions. The general who ultimately gained control of Egypt was Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest friends and most trusted commanders. Ptolemy had fought alongside Alexander in all his major battles and had shown himself to be not just a skilled military leader, but also an intelligent administrator and politician. In 305 BC, Ptolemy officially declared himself Pharaoh Ptolemy I and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt for the next 275 years. But the Ptolemies were very different from previous foreign rulers of Egypt. While they adopted some pharaonic traditions for public ceremonies, they remained fundamentally Greek in culture, language, and identity. The Ptolemies created a unique hybrid civilization that combined Greek and Egyptian elements in ways that had never been attempted before. They built Greek-style theaters, gymnasiums, and schools alongside traditional Egyptian temples. They patronized both Greek philosophers and Egyptian priests. They created new gods that combined Greek and Egyptian attributes, like Serapis, who united aspects of Zeus and Osiris. Alexandria became the greatest city in the Mediterranean world under Ptolemaic rule. The Ptolemies invested enormous resources in making their capital a center of learning and culture that would rival Athens in its golden age. They built the famous Library of Alexandria, which attempted to collect all the knowledge in the world, and the Mouseion, a research institute where scholars could pursue advanced studies in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. The Library of Alexandria was more than just a collection of books. It was the world's first true university and research center. Scholars from throughout the Greek world came to Alexandria to study and teach. They translated works from Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, and Indian sources into Greek, making Alexandria the crossroads where different intellectual traditions met and influenced each other. Some of the greatest minds in human history worked in Alexandria during the Ptolemaic period. Euclid developed his system of geometry there. Archimedes studied mathematics and engineering at the library. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Hipparchus created the first star charts and discovered the precession of the equinoxes. But Alexandria wasn't just a center for abstract learning, it was also a hub of technological innovation. Alexandrian engineers developed new types of siege engines, water clocks, and mechanical devices. The famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, demonstrated the city's mastery of both engineering and architecture. The lighthouse stood over 400 feet tall on the island of Pharaohs in Alexandria's harbor. During the day, it used mirrors to reflect sunlight as a navigation aid for ships. At night, a fire at its top provided a beacon that could be seen for miles out to sea. The lighthouse was both a practical navigation aid and a symbol of Alexandria's status as the greatest port city in the Mediterranean. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt became wealthy again through trade rather than conquest. Alexandria's merchants traded throughout the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean, bringing exotic goods from as far away as India, China, and tropical Africa to European markets. This trade made Egypt rich enough to support both traditional Egyptian temple complexes and new Greek-style buildings and institutions. The Ptolemies maintained traditional Egyptian religious practices, while also introducing Greek cults and festivals. They built magnificent temples to Egyptian gods like Isis, Horus, and Sobek, but these temples often incorporated Greek architectural elements and artistic styles. They also introduced the worship of Greek gods like Dionysus and Aphrodite to Egyptian communities. This cultural fusion created new forms of art and architecture that were neither purely Egyptian nor purely Greek, but something entirely new. Ptolemaic art combined the idealized beauty of Greek sculpture with the symbolic power of Egyptian religious imagery. Ptolemaic architecture used Greek columns and pediments to frame traditional Egyptian temple layouts. The Ptolemaic period also saw the development of new forms of literature and learning that drew on both Greek and Egyptian traditions. The Ptolemies patronized poets who wrote in Greek about Egyptian themes, historians who recorded both Greek and Egyptian versions of historical events, and scholars who studied both Greek philosophy and Egyptian religious texts. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ptolemaic civilization was how it managed to preserve Egyptian culture while transforming it. The hieroglyphic writing system continued to be used throughout the Ptolemaic period, and Egyptian scribes continued to copy and preserve ancient religious texts. Egyptian art and architecture evolved according to their own internal logic, rather than simply copying Greek models. This cultural preservation was particularly important because the Ptolemaic period saw the rise of Rome as the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. As Roman influence grew stronger, Egypt would need all of its cultural resources to maintain its distinct identity in an increasingly Roman world. Chapter 13. Cleopatra, Last Pharaoh. The final chapter in the story of pharaonic Egypt centers on one of the most famous women in all of history, Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Her story is one of intelligence, ambition, romance, and tragedy, played out against the backdrop of Egypt's final struggle for independence against the rising power of Rome. Cleopatra was born around 69 BC into the Ptolemaic royal family, but by her time, the dynasty was a shadow of its former glory. The later Ptolemies had been weakened by family feuds, civil wars, and increasing Roman interference in Egyptian affairs. Egypt was still wealthy, but it was no longer the independent great power it had been for over 3,000 years. When Cleopatra became pharaoh in 51 BC at the age of 18, she faced enormous challenges. Egypt owed huge debts to Roman moneylenders. The kingdom was torn by internal strife between different factions of the royal family. Most seriously, Rome was becoming increasingly aggressive in its treatment of client kingdoms, and many Romans believed that Egypt should be directly annexed as a Roman province. But Cleopatra was an extraordinary individual who proved more than capable of rising to these challenges. Unlike her immediate predecessors, who had been content to reign as Roman puppets, Cleopatra was determined to restore Egypt's independence and power. She was highly intelligent, speaking at least 9 languages and receiving an excellent education in mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and politics. Most importantly, Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years who bothered to learn to speak Egyptian. This gave her a connection to the native Egyptian population that her predecessors had lacked and helped her present herself as a true pharaoh rather than just another foreign ruler. Cleopatra's reign began with a civil war against her younger brother Ptolemy III, who also claimed the throne according to Ptolemaic tradition. This conflict gave her the opportunity to form an alliance with Rome that would define the rest of her career. In 48 BC, the Roman general Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria while pursuing his rival Pompey in the Roman Civil War. The meeting between Cleopatra and Caesar was one of the most consequential encounters in ancient history. According to legend, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence rolled up in a carpet, a dramatic entrance that immediately captured the Roman general's attention. But their relationship was based on much more than physical attraction. Caesar, who was 52 years old and had vast experience in politics and war, immediately recognized Cleopatra's exceptional intelligence and political skills. Cleopatra, for her part, saw in Caesar the powerful Roman ally that Egypt needed to maintain its independence. Their alliance was both personal and political. Caesar helped Cleopatra defeat her brother and secure undisputed control of Egypt. In return, Cleopatra provided Caesar with Egypt's wealth and resources to support his own political ambitions in Rome. Their relationship also produced a son, Caesarion, who Cleopatra claimed was Caesar's heir. For 3 years, from 48 to 45 BC, Cleopatra and Caesar ruled their respective domains as allies and lovers. Cleopatra even lived in Rome for extended periods, staying in Caesar's villa and participating in Roman high society. She brought Egyptian scholars, artists, and luxury goods to Rome, introducing Roman elites to the sophisticated culture of Alexandria. But this golden period came to an abrupt end on the Ides of March, 44 BC, when Caesar was assassinated by a group of Roman senators who feared he was becoming too powerful. Caesar's death left Cleopatra politically isolated and vulnerable. She quickly returned to Egypt to secure her position there while the Roman world erupted in civil war. The assassination of Caesar led to over a decade of conflict as different Roman leaders fought for control of the empire. Eventually, the struggle came down to 2 main contenders: Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, and Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most trusted generals and closest friends. In 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus in modern Turkey to discuss Egypt's role in the ongoing Roman civil war. Like her first meeting with Caesar, Cleopatra's encounter with Antony was carefully staged for maximum dramatic impact. According to the Roman historian Plutarch, Cleopatra arrived for the meeting dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, sailing up the river in a golden barge with purple sails and silver oars. She reclined under a canopy of gold cloth, fanned by boys dressed as cupids, while women dressed as sea nymphs worked the sails and guided the steering. The spectacle was designed to overwhelm Antony with Egypt's wealth and Cleopatra's own majesty, and it worked perfectly. Antony, who prided himself on his appreciation for luxury and beauty, was completely captivated by the Egyptian queen. But like Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar, her alliance with Antony was based on practical politics as much as personal attraction. Antony controlled the eastern half of the Roman Empire and needed Egypt's resources to fund his military campaigns. Cleopatra needed Roman protection to maintain Egypt's independence from direct Roman rule. Their relationship developed over several years into both a passionate love affair and a powerful political partnership. They had 3 children together and spent extended periods in both Egypt and various Roman territories. Antony granted Cleopatra control over additional territories in Syria, Cyprus, and Crete, temporarily restoring something approaching Egypt's ancient imperial boundaries. Together, Antony and Cleopatra dreamed of creating a new kind of empire that would combine Roman military power with Egyptian wealth and Greek culture. They envisioned themselves as the new Isis and Dionysus, divine rulers of an Eastern empire that would rival Rome itself in power and sophistication. But these ambitions brought them into direct conflict with Octavian, who saw Antony and Cleopatra as threats to Roman supremacy. Octavian was a brilliant politician who understood how to use Roman prejudices against foreigners and women to turn public opinion against his rivals. Octavian portrayed Antony as a Roman general who had been corrupted by foreign luxury and feminine wiles. He claimed that Cleopatra was planning to rule Rome from Alexandria, and that Antony had betrayed his Roman heritage by falling under the spell of an Egyptian sorceress. This propaganda campaign was remarkably effective. By 32 BC, Octavian had convinced the Roman Senate to declare war not on Antony, who was still technically a Roman citizen, but on Cleopatra personally. This allowed Octavian to present the conflict as a patriotic war against a foreign enemy rather than a Roman civil war. The final confrontation between Octavian and the Antony-Cleopatra alliance came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC. The battle was fought off the western coast of Greece, with both sides assembling massive fleets for what everyone knew would be a decisive encounter. The Battle of Actium was one of the most important naval conflicts in ancient history. Octavian commanded a fleet of smaller, more maneuverable Roman ships, while Antony and Cleopatra had larger vessels carrying more soldiers and heavier weapons. The outcome would determine not just the fate of the Roman Empire, but also the survival of independent Egypt. The battle began well for Antony and Cleopatra, with their larger ships initially gaining the advantage. But as the fighting continued, Octavian's superior tactics and more experienced crews began to tell. When Cleopatra saw that the battle was turning against them, she made the fateful decision to break off the engagement and sail back to Egypt with her portion of the fleet. Antony, seeing Cleopatra's ships departing, abandoned his own fleet and followed her. This decision sealed their fate. Without their commanders, Antony's remaining forces quickly surrendered to Octavian, giving him complete victory. Back in Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra spent their final months preparing for Octavian's inevitable invasion while trying to negotiate some kind of settlement that might save their lives and preserve Egypt's independence. But Octavian was determined to eliminate them as threats and to add Egypt's wealth to Rome's treasury. When Octavian's forces finally reached Alexandria in 30 BC, resistance crumbled quickly. Antony, believing false reports that Cleopatra had already committed suicide, fell on his sword in the Roman tradition. He died in Cleopatra's arms, reportedly declaring his love for her with his final breath. Cleopatra herself was captured by Octavian's forces, but she was not yet ready to surrender. According to multiple ancient sources, She spent her final days in captivity, attempting to seduce Octavian as she had Caesar and Antony before him. But Octavian, who was much younger and more cautious than her previous Roman lovers, proved immune to her charms. When Cleopatra realized that Octavian intended to take her to Rome as a prisoner to be displayed in his triumph parade, she chose death over humiliation. On August 12, 30 BC, she committed suicide in her palace apartments, probably by allowing a poisonous asp to bite her, though some sources suggest she used poison. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end after 275 years of rule. More significantly, Pharaonic civilization itself finally died after more than 3,000 years of continuous existence. Egypt became a Roman province, ruled by Roman governors appointed by the emperor in Rome. Cleopatra's death marked the end of the ancient world's last independent Hellenistic kingdom and the completion of Rome's domination of the Mediterranean world. But in another sense, her story marked the beginning of Egypt's transformation into something new, a Roman province that would eventually become a Christian land and then an Islamic one, each phase adding new layers to the ancient civilization of the Nile. The last pharaoh of Egypt was remarkable not just for her political skills and personal charisma, but for her genuine attempt to preserve Egyptian independence in an age when Rome was devouring all the ancient kingdoms of the Mediterranean world. Though she ultimately failed, her efforts ensured that Egypt remained Egyptian in culture and identity even under foreign rule. Cleopatra's legacy extended far beyond her own lifetime. Her story inspired countless works of art, literature, and drama throughout the centuries that followed. She became a symbol of female power, exotic beauty, and tragic love that continues to fascinate people today, more than 2,000 years after her death. But perhaps more importantly, Cleopatra represented the end of an era that had begun with Narmer's unification of Egypt over 3,000 years earlier. She was the last ruler who could legitimately claim to be pharaoh, the last to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the last to be worshipped as a living goddess by the Egyptian people. When Cleopatra died in Alexandria on that August day in 30,000 BC, she took with her not just her own dreams of Egyptian independence, but the entire ancient world of the pharaohs. The age of the god-kings was over. Egypt would continue to exist, but it would never again be the Egypt of the pyramids, the temples, and the divine pharaohs who had ruled along the Nile for 3 millennia. Part 4. Roman Rule and Slow Fade. Chapter 14. Egypt becomes Roman province. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, Egypt entered an entirely new phase of its long history. For over 3,000 years, the land of the Nile had been ruled by pharaohs, god-kings who were believed to be divine intermediaries between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Now, for the first time since Narmer's unification, Egypt had no pharaoh at all. Octavian, who would soon become the Emperor Augustus, had no intention of continuing the pharaonic tradition. Unlike previous foreign conquerors who had adopted Egyptian customs and presented themselves as legitimate pharaohs, the Romans saw Egypt purely as a source of wealth to fuel their growing empire. Augustus declared Egypt his personal property, not a province of the Roman state, but his own private kingdom to be administered for his benefit. The immediate consequences of Roman rule were dramatic and far-reaching. Augustus appointed Cornelius Gallus as the first Roman prefect of Egypt, giving him instructions to extract as much wealth as possible from the newly conquered territory. Roman tax collectors swarmed throughout the Nile Valley, systematically cataloging Egypt's resources and establishing tribute payments that would flow directly to Rome. The scale of this wealth extraction was unprecedented in Egyptian history. Previous foreign rulers, the Persians, the Ptolemies, had taken tribute from Egypt, but they had also invested heavily in Egyptian temples, monuments, and infrastructure. The Romans were different. They saw Egypt as a cow to be milked, not a civilization to be nurtured. Roman ships began carrying Egypt's grain harvest to Rome by the millions of tons each year. Egypt had always been fertile, but now virtually all of its agricultural surplus was being shipped away to feed the growing population of the imperial capital. Some historians estimate that Egypt provided nearly 1/3 of Rome's total grain supply during the early imperial period. But grain was just the beginning. Roman administrators systematically stripped Egypt of its accumulated treasures: gold from Nubian mines, precious stones from the eastern desert, ivory from trading expeditions to Africa. All of it flowed north to Rome. The wealth that had been accumulating in Egyptian temples and royal treasuries for millennia was carried away in Roman ships. Most significantly, the Romans began to dismantle the religious and cultural institutions that had sustained Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. The pharaonic court, with its elaborate ceremonies and divine rituals, was abolished entirely. The great temples, which had served as centers of learning, economic activity, and community life, were gradually stripped of their wealth and influence. This wasn't necessarily a deliberate attempt to destroy Egyptian culture. The Romans were generally tolerant of local customs and religions throughout their empire, but the economic pressures of Roman rule made it increasingly difficult for Egyptian institutions to survive. Temples that had relied on royal patronage and tribute from conquered territories found themselves impoverished and unable to maintain their traditional activities. The process was gradual but inexorable. During the first century of Roman rule, many temples continued to function much as they always had. Egyptian priests still performed the ancient rituals, scribes still wrote in hieroglyphs, and artists still created works in the traditional Egyptian style. To a casual observer visiting Egypt around 20 or 30 AD, the country might have seemed much as it had under the Ptolemies, but beneath the surface, fundamental changes were taking place. The priestly schools where young Egyptians had learned to read and write hieroglyphs were losing their funding and closing their doors. The workshops where craftsmen had created traditional Egyptian art were being converted to produce goods for Roman markets. The festivals and ceremonies that had connected ordinary Egyptians to their ancient traditions were becoming simpler and less frequent. Perhaps most importantly, the intellectual tradition that had sustained Egyptian civilization was slowly dying. For over 3,000 years, Egyptian scribes had been copying and preserving ancient texts, ensuring that knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. Under Roman rule, this tradition began to break down as fewer young people learned to read hieroglyphs and fewer resources were available for maintaining temple libraries. The Romans did contribute some positive elements to Egyptian civilization. They built new roads, improved harbor facilities, and introduced new agricultural techniques that increased crop yields. Roman law provided a more consistent legal system than Egypt had known under the later Ptolemies. Roman engineering skills were applied to improving irrigation systems and building new aqueducts and sewage systems in Alexandria and other major cities. But these improvements were designed to serve Roman interests rather than Egyptian ones. Better roads made it easier to transport Egyptian wealth to Roman ports. Improved harbors facilitated the grain ships that carried Egypt's harvest to Rome. More efficient agriculture meant higher tax revenues for the Roman treasury. During the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Egypt remained prosperous under Roman rule, but it was a different kind of prosperity than the country had known under native pharaohs or even the Ptolemies. Egypt was becoming what economists would call an extractive economy, a place that produced raw materials and agricultural products to be consumed elsewhere, rather than a center of manufacturing, trade, and cultural innovation. This transformation had profound social and cultural consequences. The Egyptian elite, who had traditionally served as priests, scribes, and administrators, found their roles increasingly marginalized. Roman administrators who spoke Latin or Greek rather than Egyptian took over most government positions. Roman merchants, backed by imperial capital, dominated trade networks that had previously been controlled by Egyptian businessmen. Ordinary Egyptians felt these changes less immediately, but their effects accumulated over time. Traditional festivals became less elaborate as temple resources dwindled. Local crafts traditions were disrupted as Roman manufactured goods flooded Egyptian markets. Even the ancient rhythm of Egyptian life, tied to the Nile's annual flood, began to change as Roman hydraulic engineers modified irrigation systems to maximize agricultural output. Around 100 AD, something new began to appear in Egypt that would ultimately transform the country more completely than even Roman political control. Christian missionaries following the trade routes that connected Egypt to Palestine and Syria began preaching a new religion that offered salvation to all people, regardless of their social status or ethnic background. Christianity arrived in Egypt during the reign of the Roman Emperor Trajan, probably brought by merchants and travelers from Palestine, where the new religion was already spreading rapidly. At first, Christianity was just one of many foreign religious cults that found followers in cosmopolitan Roman Egypt. Alexandria, in particular, had always been home to diverse religious communities, including Jews, Greeks, and followers of various mystery religions from throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. But Christianity was different from these other imported religions. While most foreign cults remained confined to specific ethnic communities, Christianity actively sought converts from all backgrounds. Christian missionaries preached in Egyptian as well as Greek, making their message accessible to native Egyptians who had been excluded from the primarily Greek-speaking Christian communities in other parts of the Roman Empire. More importantly, Christianity offered something that traditional Egyptian religion was increasingly unable to provide: a sense of hope and purpose in a world that seemed to be slipping away from Egyptian control. Traditional Egyptian religion had always promised immortality to those who followed proper burial practices and religious rituals, but these practices were becoming increasingly expensive and difficult to maintain under Roman rule. Christianity, by contrast, offered salvation to anyone who accepted its teachings, regardless of their ability to afford elaborate tombs or mummification procedures. Christian teachings about the resurrection of the dead resonated with Egyptians who had always believed in life after death, but Christian practices were much simpler and less expensive than traditional Egyptian religious observances. The spread of Christianity in Egypt was remarkably rapid. By 200 AD, there were substantial Christian communities throughout the Nile Valley. By 300 AD, Christianity was probably the dominant religion in many parts of Egypt, especially in the cities and towns along the river. This religious transformation had enormous cultural consequences. Christianity was fundamentally incompatible with traditional Egyptian polytheism. While Egyptian religion had always been tolerant of foreign gods and had easily incorporated Greek and Roman deities into its pantheon, Christianity insisted that there was only one true God and that all other gods were false. As more Egyptians converted to Christianity, they stopped participating in traditional religious festivals. They stopped visiting Egyptian temples. Most critically, they stopped learning to read hieroglyphs, which were associated with pagan religious texts. The ancient Egyptian writing system, which had been in continuous use for over 3,000 years, began its final decline. Christian Egyptians developed their own writing system, called Coptic, which used Greek letters with some additional symbols to represent sounds that didn't exist in Greek. Coptic became the language of Egyptian Christianity and eventually the last direct descendant of the ancient Egyptian language. But Coptic was fundamentally different from hieroglyphic Egyptian. It was designed for Christian religious purposes and had no connection to the vast literature of ancient Egyptian religion, history, and science. When Egyptians stopped learning hieroglyphs and began writing in Coptic instead, they lost access to their own cultural heritage. The abandonment of hieroglyphic writing didn't happen all at once. Temple inscriptions continued to be carved in hieroglyphs well into the Roman period, and some Egyptian priests maintained the ability to read and write the ancient script. But the number of people who possessed these skills grew smaller with each generation. By 300 AD, hieroglyphic writing was probably confined to a small community of elderly priests in remote temples. By 350 AD, it may have been extinct, except for a few individuals who preserved the knowledge for historical or nostalgic reasons. The last datable hieroglyphic inscription was carved on Philae Island in 394 AD, more than 3,500 years after the first Egyptian hieroglyphs appeared. As hieroglyphic writing disappeared, so did access to the accumulated wisdom of Egyptian civilization. The medical texts that had made Egyptian physicians famous throughout the ancient world became unreadable. The mathematical and astronomical treatises that had guided pyramid construction were forgotten. The religious literature that had sustained Egyptian culture for millennia was abandoned. This cultural amnesia was accelerated by the official adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire under Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century AD. Once Christianity became the official religion of the empire, Egyptian temples lost the last vestiges of government support. Many were officially closed, their endowments confiscated, and their priesthoods disbanded. Some temples were converted into Christian churches, their ancient reliefs and paintings covered with plaster and painted over with Christian imagery. Others were simply abandoned to the desert sands. The great temple complexes at Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel, monuments that had been continuously maintained for over 2,000 years, were left to decay. The final end. By 400 AD, the transformation of Egypt was nearly complete. The country that had given birth to one of humanity's greatest civilizations had become just another province in the vast Roman Empire. The ancient gods were silent, their temples empty or converted to new purposes. The hieroglyphic writing that had recorded 3,000 years of Egyptian history was a forgotten mystery. In the villages along the Nile, life continued much as it always had. Farmers still planted their crops when the flood receded and harvested them when the grain was ripe. Craftsmen still made pottery, wove cloth, and built houses from mud brick. Merchants still traded goods up and down the river. But the great traditions that had made Egypt unique, the pharaonic ceremonies, the temple rituals, the monumental architecture, were fading into memory. The desert, which had always pressed against the edges of Egyptian civilization, began to reclaim territory that had been cultivated for millennia. Temples that were no longer maintained were gradually buried by blowing sand. Irrigation canals that were no longer cleaned filled with silt and became useless. Towns that depended on temple economies were abandoned as their populations moved to places where they could make a living. The great monuments that had defined Egyptian civilization for so long became curiosities visited by Roman tourists who marveled at their size and craftsmanship but had no understanding of their original meaning or purpose. Roman writers like Strabo and Pliny described the pyramids and temples with admiration, but they wrote about them as ancient ruins rather than as living parts of a functioning civilization. As the centuries passed, even the memory of what these monuments had represented began to fade. Local people told stories about the pyramids and temples, but these stories bore less and less resemblance to historical reality. The pyramids became the tombs of legendary kings, whose names were half remembered or completely invented. The temples became the palaces of mythical rulers who had commanded magical powers. The Sphinx, that ancient guardian of the Giza plateau, became buried up to its neck in sand. The great statue that had watched over the pyramids for over 4,000 years was slowly disappearing beneath the desert that had always been its enemy. Local people called it Father of Terror and told stories about how it devoured travelers who couldn't answer its riddles. The process of forgetting was gradual but inexorable. Each generation remembered a little less than the one before. Children grew up speaking Coptic instead of ancient Egyptian. They learned about Christ and the apostles instead of Ra and Osiris. They were taught to read the Bible instead of hieroglyphic inscriptions. By 500 AD, it's likely that no one in Egypt could read hieroglyphic writing fluently. The ancient script that had been used continuously for over 3,000 years had become as mysterious to Egyptians as it was to foreign visitors. The great temples were filled with inscriptions that told the stories of gods and pharaohs, but no one alive could understand what they said. The Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 AD marked another major transition in the country's history. The Arabs, unlike the Romans and Byzantines, were not primarily interested in extracting wealth from Egypt. They saw it as a permanent home for Islamic civilization. Under Islamic rule, Egypt would eventually experience cultural and economic renewal, but it would be a completely different kind of civilization from the one that had flourished under the pharaohs. The new Islamic rulers of Egypt had no connection to or interest in the ancient pharaonic culture. They saw the great monuments as examples of pre-Islamic ignorance, impressive perhaps as examples of human craftsmanship, but irrelevant to the spiritual needs of a Muslim society. Some monuments were quarried for stone to build mosques and palaces. Others were simply ignored and left to decay. By 800 AD, the great age of pharaonic Egypt was as remote and mysterious to the people living along the Nile as it is to us today. 1,000 years had passed since the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved. 1,500 years had passed since the last traditional pharaoh had ruled. The connection between modern Egypt and ancient Egypt had been completely severed. The physical monuments remained, of course. The pyramids were too massive to be destroyed or completely buried. The great temples, though damaged by time, earthquake, and human interference, still stood as testimony to their builders' skill. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings still contained their mummified occupants, though most had been robbed of their treasures. But these monuments had become riddles without answers. Travelers from Europe who visited Egypt during the medieval period wrote about the pyramids and temples with wonder, but they had no idea who had built them or why. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that covered every surface were as mysterious as alien writing. The mummies in the tombs were curiosities to be collected, rather than the remains of real people with names and histories. This situation continued for over 1,000 years. Egypt remained a land of mysteries, home to monuments that clearly testified to a great civilization, but one whose nature and achievements were completely unknown. European scholars speculated about the builders of the pyramids, creating elaborate theories that bore no relationship to historical reality. Then, in 1798, everything began to change. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt brought with it a team of scholars and artists whose job was to study and document Egypt's ancient monuments. These scholars approached the ancient sites with scientific methods and careful observation rather than fantasy and speculation. Among the monuments they documented was a stone discovered near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta. This stone, which would become known as the Rosetta Stone, contained the same text written in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphic Egyptian, Demotic Egyptian, and ancient Greek. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone provided the key that would eventually unlock the mystery of hieroglyphic writing. French scholar Jean-François Champollion spent years comparing the 3 versions of the text, gradually working out how hieroglyphic symbols corresponded to sounds and words. In 1822, he announced his breakthrough. For the first time in over 2,400 years, someone could read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphic writing marked the beginning of modern Egyptology and the rediscovery of ancient Egyptian civilization. Suddenly, the temples and tombs that had been mute for so many centuries began to speak again. The names and deeds of pharaohs emerged from oblivion. The stories of gods and goddesses were recovered. The daily life of ancient Egyptians became visible again. Over the following 2 centuries, archaeologists, linguists, and historians have gradually pieced together the story of ancient Egypt. They've excavated buried cities, translated countless inscriptions, and studied mummies with modern scientific techniques. The civilization that had been forgotten for over a millennium has been brought back to life through scholarship and research. Today, we know more about ancient Egypt than any people have known since the last hieroglyphic scribe died over 1,600 years ago. We can read the names of pharaohs in their own writing. We can understand the religious beliefs that motivated the construction of the pyramids. We can follow the daily lives of ordinary Egyptians through their letters, legal documents, and personal effects. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt has been one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern world. It has restored to humanity a chapter of its own history that had been completely lost. The pharaohs speak to us again across the centuries. The gods of Egypt have found new worshippers in the form of scholars and tourists who come to marvel at their monuments. But perhaps most importantly, the rediscovery of ancient Egypt reminds us of both the permanence and the fragility of human civilization. The Egyptians built monuments designed to last forever, and in a sense they succeeded. The pyramids and temples still stand after 4,000 years. But the civilization that created those monuments disappeared so completely that its own descendants forgot who had built them. Ancient Egypt teaches us that no civilization, no matter how powerful or sophisticated, is guaranteed to survive forever. But it also shows us that human achievements, when they're built on solid foundations and created with skill and dedication, can endure long after their creators have been forgotten. The pharaohs may be gone, but their monuments remain as testimony to human aspiration and achievement. As we drift off to sleep beside the eternal Nile, we can reflect on this incredible journey through 3,000 years of Egyptian history. From Narmer's first unification of the two kingdoms to Cleopatra's final stand against Rome, from the building of the first pyramid to the writing of the last hieroglyph, we've witnessed the rise and fall of one of humanity's greatest civilizations. The story of ancient Egypt is ultimately a human story. The story of people who looked at the desert around them and decided to build something permanent and beautiful. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, creating monuments and artworks that still inspire wonder today. Though their civilization has passed into history, their achievements remain as proof of what human beings can accomplish when they work together toward a common vision. The pharaohs sleep in their tombs along the Nile, but their legacy lives on in every person who has ever been moved by the sight of the pyramids or wondered at the mystery of the Sphinx. Ancient Egypt may have ended, but it will never be forgotten again. The desert sands that once covered the monuments have been swept away by the winds of rediscovery, revealing treasures that enrich all of humanity. And so the great river flows on, carrying its life-giving waters through the same land where pharaohs once ruled as gods, where pyramids rose to touch the sky, and where scribes recorded the deeds of kings in hieroglyphs that we can read again today. The Nile remembers everything, and through the Nile, ancient Egypt lives forever.